Similar to present-day Regis, nearly a quarter of the 1941 graduates were from Manhattan, though back then, more were clustered in the former tenements on the Upper East Side. One of them, though, lived on a narrow stretch on the East River now known as Roosevelt Island. Before the island became a tech hub, a century ago it was known as Blackwell's, then Welfare Island. New Yorkers, however, called it Damnation Island. Here were notorious facilities where authorities would exile the destitute, sick, insane, and criminal right up until the Second World War. John Fryer was born and raised on that island. His parents were Irish immigrants who had arrived only a few years before John and his two brothers were born. The family lived in a poorhouse called the City Home for Dependents, where John's father also worked as a cook. How bleak were conditions there? Decades earlier, while on a tour of America, Charles Dickens had visited that same City Home facility and described it as badly ventilated, badly lighted, not too clean, and on the whole, very uncomfortable. Regis would, quite literally, be John's way out. Several boys lived in the Washington Heights area in the northern end of Manhattan, but it was in the Bronx, notably around the Fordham area, which had the largest cluster of the 1941 graduates. In the 1920s and 30s, the Bronx was experiencing its greatest growth. Middle and working class families from Manhattan were attracted to its cheaper and newer housing. Today, about 10% of Regians live in the borough. New commuter lines also drew boys from the eastern and northern ends of the Bronx to attend Regis, and further afield in Yonkers and Mount Vernon. During that period, the eastward expansion of the New York metropolitan into Queens was still ongoing. One area was particularly interesting. In the 1930s, Jackson Heights was a relatively new suburban development. Just 2 decades earlier, the region was still mostly marsh and farmland. Although located in present-day Queens, back then, residents considered the Jackson Heights a part of Long Island. The local parish, St. Joan of Arc, was only established in 1920 and famously with donations from Babe Ruth. The parish and surrounding families were predominantly Irish and German Catholics. Significantly for the story of the class of 1941, the local parochial school won the largest number of scholarships to Regis. 12 boys from the St. Joan of Arc school were accepted that year, a remarkable accomplishment considering that the grammar school had only been operating for 14 years. Gerard, or Jerry Donahue, was one of them. Jerry would recall that there were 60 boys and girls in his grade at St. Joan, which made the 12 acceptances even more impressive. One of 2 boys in the family, Jerry lived his entire life in Jackson Heights. Jerry's family was middle class, albeit in a period when incomes were much lower amidst the Great Depression. Nevertheless, he considered himself fortunate to live in a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom home. It was at St. Joan where Jerry met some of his lifelong friends. One of his best friends lived across an open field that is now the site of the Elmhurst Hospital. William, or Bill Carroll, grew up with Jerry as their parents were close. Their families celebrated Thanksgiving and even took vacations together. Bill's uncle had been in the very first entering class at Regis. Unfortunately, he had to drop out at the onset of the First World War to support his family when older family members were drafted. Bill had a knack for mathematics, a field that would serve him well years later. Like many future Regians, Jerry and Bill were commuting buddies. In an era where there were no cell phones, in fact, many homes didn't even have landlines, Bill would flash the lights in his bathroom to signal to Jerry to meet at the local train stop and to make their way to Regis. In the 1920s, airplanes were still a nascent technology that captivated the public. Later in life, Bill would write that as a 3-year-old, he saw the spirit of St. Louis and Charles Lindbergh up close on a Sunday trip to Long Island. It would be the start of a lifelong fascination with aircrafts. Bill and Jerry were good students. St. Joan had a tradition where after each quarter, seats were reassigned based on grade averages, with the first seat in the front row for the child with the best results. Throughout their grammar school years, Bill and Jerry would be amongst a group of 4 students who would take turns at that coveted seat near the class door. Another was Leonard Balje, who lived a little further away but whose intelligence would one day earn him the nickname Brainbuster at Regis. However, it was the fourth, Thomas McCann, who would eventually graduate from St. Joan with the school's top General Excellence Medal. His father was the neighborhood doctor, which perhaps influenced Tom's eventual pursuit into the medical field. Tom lived within a stone's throw from both Bill and Jerry, and that open field by their homes would be where they and other future Regis classmates would gather regularly to play baseball. Perhaps the bigger story here is that the large number of St. Joan boys accepted into Regis was not at all by happenstance or luck. Jerry Donahue would recall that starting in 5th grade, the Grey Nuns who ran St. Joan would encourage the boys to aspire to Regis, even though by then St. Joan had their own high school. But they weren't just motivating words. In 8th grade, a dozen or more of the boys would be given extra lessons in math and English on Saturday mornings. They were prepped in accordance with the entrance exam syllabus Regis had handed out the year before. One of those who joined was Donald Donahue, who would be Tom McCann's lifelong friend.
They went to this camp together, and literally they would get together a couple times a year through his adult life.
Donald's father worked in the civil service and his mother was a teacher. Like most Regis families, they placed a tremendous emphasis on school.
I think education was stressed in his home growing up, as he continued to stress it his whole life. That was embedded in his nature.
Those year-long extra weekend lessons by the Grey Nuns not only helped Donald get into Regis, they likely had a profound impact on him. One that would ultimately lead Donald to play a significant role in something very similar at Regis several decades later. Joe Fallon lived a block from St. Joan, so it was easy for him to attend the extra classes. He came from a very religious family and was the middle child amongst 5 children. Joe was a talented athlete and at Regis would be involved in multiple sports. Even as a freshman, he was burly and had a gruff, intimidating look, which would perhaps belie his eventual profession. Of the 12 boys who were accepted from St. Joan, these 6 would be the only ones who would eventually graduate. If Jackson Heights was a relatively new suburban community in the 1930s, several others from the class of 1941 lived further, in areas that were considered agrarian during that period. In Brooklyn, there were 2 distinct clusters. The northern end around Prospect Park was a growing industrial area, much of which revolved around the Brooklyn Naval Yards. Several other boys lived in more suburban neighborhoods further south. Of course, Regis wouldn't be the same without its New Jerseyans. In those days, only 10% of the class came from New Jersey, primarily from Jersey City where the ferry service was already well established. Today, about 20% of Regians are from the Garden State. Similar to the Jackson Heights gang who attended St. Joan, there were 4 boys in the class of 1941 who all lived within a few blocks of each other. They attended the working-class Sacred Heart Grammar School. James Greer was an only child of migrant parents. His Irish father was a shipping clerk for an oil company.
His mother was actually Canadian, and during World War I, his mother actually won the Victoria Cross, which is the British equivalent of a Congressional Medal of Honor for the services during the course of the war.
James was a gregarious character both in school and later in life.
He called everyone friend this, so he was known as Friend Greer. But he was a very good guy.
Living a street over was Frank Morley. The area the boys lived in was a very blue-collar neighborhood during that time, and Frank's father worked in a lumber yard nearby. Also from Sacred Heart was Bob Morris. The second of 4 boys, his parents were both from Ireland and had settled in Jersey City, where the elder Morris was a railroad car inspector. Rounding up the group was Tom Delaney, whose parents were also Irish immigrants. He was the only boy in a family with 4 daughters. Tom would be a lifelong resident in Jersey City, where his father was a police officer, a career Tom would also eventually follow. Overall, these were the homes where the graduates from 1941 lived. And while some from Connecticut and Staten Island enrolled as freshmen, none would complete their studies at Regis in that class.